Dear students, welcome to massive open online course on research methodology in history. Today we shall be discussing about the Annales School of Historians. The historiographical revolution in France between 1930s and 1960s that took place is associated with a journal, Annales of Economic and Social History. It was founded in 1929 by Lucien Febvre and Marc Bloch. Lucien Febvre is credited for bringing international reckoning for this journal. By 1947, the journal had secured an institutional base. It also secured an ideological base by claiming that Annales School initiated a new kind of history. Now we shall be looking the Annales approach to the concept of history and history writing. The Annales approach to history writing was interdisciplinary and based on collaborative research. It emphasized on problem-oriented analytical approach. Although economic history was given more prominence in the initial issues of this journal, the emphasis was on areas of collective psychological and cultural underpinnings of social and economic history. Much of the emphasis of the Annales School was on studying the dynamic relationship between human society and its physical environment, and the primacy of larger structures related to geography, economy, and social psychology in explaining life, behavior, and thinking of individuals. Annales School's contribution to the evolution of the concept of history and the methodology of history writing has been described eloquently by Emmanual Le Roy Ladurie. He remarked that Annales School showed, quote, "Beneath the episodic event lay the long durée. Beneath the political film lay economic and social structures. Beneath the urban minority lay the rural majority." Unquote. Another remarkable characteristic of the Annales School was the overt presence of the enunciator in history writing. This marked a sharp break with the scientific tradition of history writing, where the historian's personality was desired to be effaced. Probably the most significant contribution was the introduction of a variegated notion of time as opposed to the homogeneous, uniform, and linear time that prevailed. The corresponding terms for the notion of time are structure, conjecture, and event. The structure deals with millennia of time. The conjecture deals with the centuries, and the events with years, months, days. Annal historians also widened the spatial horizon of history as its emphasis shifted from national to regional or supranational. Now we shall be looking at the major intellectual currents that had influenced the Annal historians. The Annal movement was greatly influenced by Marxist philosophy, according to which structural factors were rooted in material condition. This movement was also influenced by sociologists' approach to the studies of social structure, family, religion, and many other issues. The works of Max Weber and Émile Durkheim's journal, L'année sociologique, profoundly influenced this movement. François Simond, in his article entitled Historical Method and Social Science, had attacked the dominant historical paradigm of political idol, individual idol, and chronological idol. He argued that a historian's preoccupation with political diplomatic history or emphasis on the history of the individual and the obsession with the search for origin provides only a linear narrative. Annales school's conception of proper history as long-term, problem-oriented, based on model and search for structure can be traced to Simia's article. Paul Vidal du La Blache's geographical approach promoted historians to make an observation of the social milieu and everyday life of the people. In his journal Annales de Géographie, he encouraged interdisciplinary approaches. The journal turned annal historians' attention towards production of regional monograph, which later became one of the main characteristics of the Annales school. Henri Barr, in his journal Revue de Synthèse Historique, criticized fact-oriented political history writing. He also criticized Durkheim's approach to introduce all historical phenomena into the same frame, and most importantly, the tendency of fragmenting knowledge into numerous disciplines. He argued for an approach that would encompass the discipline of geography, sociology, economy, and history. He called for a total history that would take into account everything from economy to mentality. Now we shall be looking at some of the annal historians. First we will study about Lucien Febvre and Marc Bloch. These two annal historians are the historians of the first phase of the annal movement. This first phase is marked by a strong opposition to the tradition of political history. So first, Lucien Febvre. Lucien Febvre, in his La France Comptée, has studied the struggle between the two classes of a declining nobility and the rising class of bourgeois. He perceived that this conflict was not economic in nature, but rather involved ideas and feelings. In his A Geographical Introduction to History, he moved away from geographical determinism and emphasized on the multiplicity of human response to coping with particular environmental surroundings. According to him, geography did not unilaterally impose necessity on humans, but provided manifold possibilities. His Martin Luther, A Destiny. This book reflected his interest in the history of mentalities, to be particular in the social history of religion. Febvre demonstrated that Luther was not simply representative of the emerging bourgeois interest, despite the fact that it was the bourgeois class who were his supporters. Febvre asserted that there existed a creative tension between an individual's ideas and their relevance for a group. He further asserted that spiritual beliefs and practices were not simple expression of economic or social changes. His greatest work, The Problem of Unbelief in the 16th Century, The Religion of Rebellion. This was the founding block of the history of mentalities. He set out to demolish the notion that Rabelais was a covert atheist. He argued that the intellectuals in the 16th century did not have the language, the science, or the analytical tool to pursue a philosophical argument about the existence of God. Hence, the term atheism with its modern connotation, was anachronistic in the context of 16th century. He placed Rabelais' anti-Christian jokes more in tradition with the contemporary parody of the sacred. Now we'll be looking at Marc Bloch, another important historian of this period. Marc Bloch's seminal work is The Royal Touch. In this work, he unravels the collective human psyche by studying popular rumors such as the king's touch could cure malevolent skin diseases. Here the king was both the king of France and the king of Britain. Bloch was greatly influenced by the anthropological writings of Marcel Mauss and James Frazer. The Royal Touch is a work of political anthropology, where he argued that the mental universe did not always conform to rational behavior, nor can it be determined by economic interest alone, but rather it possessed autonomy. Bloch also made a comparative study of this phenomena across several regions to reveal the common elements across different cultures and societies. This comparative study highlights how different cultures influence and change the contours of a particular phenomena. Another significant work of Bloch was French Rural History. This work is important for not only making a comparative study of the developments in Britain and France between 13th and 18th century, but more importantly, it used non-literary sources. Bloch used estate maps and aerial photographs for studying land settlements. He called this methodology a regressive method, which meant a systematic chronological backward movement starting from the present and moving incrementally back into the past. In this methodology, he was greatly influenced by the researches in historical linguistics and ethnography. Another important work of Bloch is Feudal Society. Here, he gave an anthropological explanation of feudalism. He moved away from the prevailing legal definition and explained feudalism in terms of personal and mutual relationship of dependence. Another very important work of Bloch was The Historian's Craft, where he put forward the importance of comparative history, structural analysis, problem-oriented history, constant interaction between the past and the present, and interdisciplinarity. Now, we'll move on to the second phase of the Annal movement. In the second phase, the Annal movement evolved into a school with its unique concepts such as structure, conjecture, and event, and distinctive methods such as social history of long-term changes. A pioneering historian of this phase was Fernand Braudel. Fernand Braudel developed the total history paradigm in his book The Mediterranean and the Mediterranean World in the Age of Philip II. In this book, he introduced the idea of different levels of historical times or duries. This book progresses from geography and environment to economic and social structures to narration of political events. This book is divided into three parts. The first part is called Geohistory. It deals with the history of the sea, forests, mountains, and the plains and their relationship with human being, as well as changes brought in them by the human beings over a very long period of time. Changes occur over millennia, hence it is imperceptible in human eyes. The second part is concerned with the histories of economies, polities, cultures, civilizations, and ever newer forms of warfare. Changes occur across generations and are perceptible. In the third part, Braudel is concerned with undermining the approach of history of events. He posed individuals and events in such a broad context that they become fundamentally unimportant. The longue durée cannot serve as the loci for any individual subject. In doing so, he tries to demonstrate that a history of events can only provide a superficial reading of the society's development. Now we'll move on to the third phase of the Annales movement. During this phase, we see a greater interaction with researches on new economic history, popular culture, and psychology. As a result, history of mentalities became more refined, and we also see a renewed interest in the political histories and introduction of women's history. These are some of the remarkable characteristics of the third phase of Annales movement. Now we shall be looking at some of the pioneering historians of this third phase of Annales movement. Georges Duby. Georges Duby believed that the history of the ordinary people or the persons in society are more useful than the one concerning exceptional people such as princes, generals, bishops, or financiers. Although he emphasized the importance of the long term, he found important and big events could bring out hidden ideas and grievances and provide historical access to people's mentalities. His major publication was Rural Economy and Country Life in the Medieval West. This book deals with the European economy and society during the medieval period, discussing the origin, development, and decline of feudalism. It highlighted the control of rural resources and ruthless exploitation of the peasants by the rising military elites around the 11th century. His other famous work was an article entitled Youth in Aristocratic Society. In this article, he explored the social concept of youth, which did not connote biological age alone, but rather included people of diverse age. According to him, since most men married at an advanced age or some did not marry at all, the concept of youth could be found among men of advanced ages. This concept was decisive in shaping local cultures. In his The Three-Order Feudal Society Imagined, in this book, he explored the origin and medieval development of the three estates in French society: the nobility, clergy, and the common men. According to Duby, the precedence of the common men was first introduced in the 11th century, replacing the Christian conception of society, which was divided between the clergy and the laity. In the 12th century, the tripartite model was adopted by the nobility to strengthen their privileged position, which was then adopted by the state. Duby's interest in the institution of marriage and family is evident in his work Medieval Marriage and The Knight, the Lady, and the Priest. In these two works, he had traced the changes in the institution of marriage. However, his aim to quote, demystify this male discourse and find out what the position of women, unquote, prompted him to write a trilogy of women of the 12th century. However, as Anne Kettle argued that what Duby wrote was primarily history of male attitude towards women. Now we will be looking at another important historian of this phase, Emmanual Le Roy Ladurie. Emmanual Le Roy Ladurie carried forward Braudel's idea of a long-term total history. According to him, landmark phenomena like the Renaissance, the Reformation, the establishment of absolutist monarchy played little role in the history of early modern France. This was because there was demographic equilibrium in France in early 14th and early 18th century. His first significant work was The Peasant of Languedoc. This work is remarkable for its use of quantitative data for the serial history of population and prices based primarily on tithe records that provided useful comparative data for a long period. He stressed the role of Malthusian dynamic while demonstrating that the economic growth from 1490 to 1570 had made the peasants poorer because the price and the population rose. He traced the phenomena through the degradation of peasants' diet. Another remarkable work was History of Climate, where he studied the meteorological phenomena over a long period. According to him, the history of climate changes from 10th to 12th century, and it falls into three phases: a warm period around 1000, a much cooler period between 1200 and 1300, and between 1580 to 1850, and finally rising temperature since 1850. He used the evidence of tree rings to make inferences about the climate and harvest. He emphasized on the long-term continuities and slow changes. In his Montillo, he explored everyday life, religious beliefs, popular rituals, and means of subsistence of about 200 persons living in the French village named Montillo during the 14th century. He described the static economic and ecological structure of the village in pre-modern France. And he also explored the mundane life and collective mentalities of the villagers. Thus, Ladurie wrote a history of mental structure of the local inhabitants. His another significant work was Love, Death and Money in the Pays-d'Oc and Jasmine's Witch. In these works, he used mostly literary sources. By studying folklores and popular beliefs about witchcraft, he argued that the pre-modern and early modern mental structure of the rural people remained unchanged. The French state and the ancient regime, A History of France, 1610 to 1774. Here, he deals with 3 centuries of French political history, focusing on kings, ministers, and the gradual formation of the French state. He asserted that although the rise of the absolutist state and the growth of a strong state bureaucracy were very significant changes, the broader structure that was demographically and economically determined remained almost constant throughout this long period. Another important historian of this period was Jacques Le Goff. Jacques Le Goff advocated historians' intimate engagement with history. He diverged from the approach of the objective truth of past and accepted the subjectivity of the historian. He advocated that scientific methodology of history writing was to be used to reimagine the past instead of reconstructing it. In his Intellectuals in the Middle Ages, he demonstrated that there was a difference between medieval intellectual culture, which was based on scholasticism and encyclopedic knowledge, and the modern intellectual culture, which was based on originality, innovation, and creation of new knowledge. Thus, he placed intellectual history on sociological foundations. The Middle Ages and the medieval civilization are important work on historical anthropology. Goff discussed the mundane lives of the people, their notion of space and time, the thoughts and feelings of various social groups, issues of diet, disease, climate, specific exploitation of female labor, and social exclusion of foreigners and handicapped persons, and historically situated the material, mental, and biological lives of past people through a study of their behavioral pattern. His most significant contribution was the birth of the purgatory. He traced the restructuring of this concept of purgatory. He traced its root in Judeo-Christian antiquities to its final emergence in the second half of the 12th century. The idea of purgatory by the 12th century came to denote a new concept of time between death and the last judgment. Thus, it complicated the notion of sin and penance. This theme was further explored in his work Your Money or Your Life, Economy and Religion in the Middle Ages. In this work, he shows how the concept of purgatory as a place that could alleviate eternal suffering helped in reconciling the dilemma of medieval Christianity regarding usury. Usury was damned in Christianity, but with the emergence of capitalism, usurers who lent money at a reasonable rates had to go through the fires of purgatory but could avoid the fire of hell. Now we'll be looking very briefly at two other important annal historians of this phase, Marc and Roger Chartier. First, Marc. He was an important historian and his contribution was in the realm of political history. The Russian Revolution of February 1917 and A Social History of Russian Revolution were some of his landmark works. He studied these great phenomena but diverged from a leader-oriented interpretation to the decisive role of the masses in popular uprising. Another historian, as I mentioned, Roger Chartier. He investigated the interaction between high culture and popular cultures, the learned and the laity, the intention of the author and the reception of the reader, and the scholarly book and the larger world of print. Now, we'll be very briefly looking at the history of mentalities. Probably the greatest contribution of the Annales school is the history of mentalities. The history of mentalities is different from the intellectual history or the history of ideas, which studies conscious thoughts. It is not confined to ideological determination of people's thought, but rather their structured cultural responses to situations. The approach of long term was crucial for studying mentalities because mentalities were not short term phenomena. They take shape over a long period of time. This trend began with Marc Bloch's The Royal Touch, Lucien, Febvre, Martin Luther, and some other seminal works. Robert Mandrou secured the history of mentalities on a more solid ground. In his Introduction to Modern France, 1500 to 1640, and Magistrates and Sorcerers in 17th century France, in these two works, he discussed people's attitude towards death, family, witchcraft, and mundane experiences. Annal historians like Duby and Goff were important practitioners of this history of mentalities. They believed that the largely unconscious, routinized collective mentality is the arena of history of mentalities. It stood in contrast with the traditional intellectual history, which focuses on the individual's mind. Since mentalities cannot always be studied through written sources, therefore, adapting the methods of semiotics, psychology, and anthropology was required. One important finding of this study was the fact that attitudes often differed on the basis of class. For example, a noble's notion of honor was different from a peasant's notion of honor. However, certain ideas were shared across different groups within a given society, and it was these ideas which constitute the common mentality of a particular age, of a particular society. With this, we come to the conclusion of our discussion. So far, we have discussed that annal historians radically changed history writing by taking into account histories of the concept of time, attitude towards death, the role of festivities, notion towards family, marriage, childhood, magic, and superstition. Also, the idea of total history, history of mentalities, serial history, and a new cultural history were devised to explore new areas and new subjects. Thank you.